A Shalom Akim, Shalom, Shalom, giving all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashem and Habashai, Bashem Rakakwadash. Double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone for teachings of truth and salutations to the sincere Akim and Aquathim. And listen, may the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Raquai. I'm back in here with another quick and Lord's will as always an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, is actually taken from the book of Ecclesiasticus, the 37th chapter. And one of the precepts, it says that be continually with a godly man, right? So, after, just a short discussion with one of my elders, I thought, okay, let me actually, I can turn this into a lesson because I figured it might be a very, very edifying, point to make, an understanding. And through some reflection, I thought about it even some more, because, when you understand, when it comes to culture, I thought about it and I'm like, you know what? As a people, it's within our culture to be able to actually have, elders, people who have, an upstanding, what's the word I'm looking for? Character, upstanding, God-fearing character, priests, people who you basically can go to for important counsel. And being a younger brother myself, I thought it would be a very good, I guess, an edifying lesson, as well, because, as a, because when you think about in this culture, in Babylonian culture, a lot of, especially our people, are basically, lost because, they don't have that connection to culture. So they're basically like children that are being tossed to and fro with all these different wayward, different doctrines and so on and so forth, right? So, when you have elders, bishops, priests, people had these sorts of positions of authority, to be able to hear and listen to some of that discourse, is very, very, important for children's development, what I'm saying? Because they actually had a lot of years, of experience, and you're able to actually promote a sentiment of like guidance in warning you in terms of certain things, hearing godly discourse, because especially when you hear the conversation, as it says in Peter's, that Lot was vexed with the filthy conversations of the wicked. That those conversations don't actually bring forth any sort of life when you're surrounded by a lot of these different people, right? And when you go into that word conversation, it refers to basically like a manner of life. So their manners of life, not just the heathens, but our people that are basically like in a Gentile state of mind, it's absolutely basically perverse, right? So this is really just to kind of hone in on, the opportunities of, being continually with a godly man to, be able to get, basically sound advice in regards to certain things, hear godly discourse, and then basically apply a lot of those different concepts, to ourselves and those that you watch over, right? Because that kind of discourse is very far and few, basically like in a desert, in this valley of shadow of death, and there is no like imagine if you're in an actual desert, there is very little fountains of little living waters, spewing out, so I know I rambled on quite a bit, but let me read the precept first. And I sincerely pray, that this lesson, is edifying, right? So let's go to Sirach, the 37th chapter. So I only have a couple, precepts, nothing too, heavy, This is Sirach chapter 37. I think I'll start at 11 and I'll jump to 12, right? And it says here that I'll start at 10 actually. It says, consult not with one that suspecteth thee, and they hide counsel, and hide thy counsel from such as envy thee, right? So, there's just certain people you don't want to consult, have certain conversations with, ultimately, because a lot of these people that you might, counsel with, they don't actually exemplify a fear of Yahweh Bashem Yahushai. You know what I'm saying? And then sometimes, they might have certain, because we tend to operate, in a very genuine and, peaceable manner, but these people don't actually carry that same vibration and that same fear and uprightness, especially our people, so, they might have certain animosity towards you, so you don't actually give them. Those are the kinds of people you don't want to consult certain situations with, right? It says here, verse 11, neither consult with a woman touching her of whom she is jealous, neither consult with a coward in matters of war, nor with a merchant concerning exchange, nor with a buyer of selling, nor with an envious man of thankfulness, nor with an unmerciful man touching kindness, nor with a slothful for any work. Because these are not people that you want to, consult with in regards to certain things, right? It says here, nor with a hireling for a year of finishing work, nor with an idle servant of much business. Hearken not unto these in matter of counsel. It says, but be continually, here's really the point I wanted to hit, but be continually with a godly man who knoweth to keep the commandments of the Lord, whose mind is according to thy mind, right? So already there is a sense of cohesion, because you're more, both of your minds are in tune with actually having a fear of Yahweh Bashem Yahushai, right? And that's very, very far and few, because there's not a lot of people that you can actually, consult with in regards to certain matters and get that sort of guidance, and that's another thing also, because Paul talks about the spiritual man judgeth all things, right? Because he's able to make those certain judgments and make those connections, so to speak, because he can, because the Spirit of the Lord is within those men to be able to make certain conclusions. And a lot of our people don't actually have that unction on them, right? They don't have that spirit on them. They're basically, as Paul described, they're natural. The natural man can't really perceive the things of the Spirit, because their discernment is on a very, very low frequency, and that, you can see that in their fruits. You can see that in their works, right? You can see that in their behaviors, in the way that they conduct themselves. I'm speaking about mostly people in the world, and a lot of these people can also be within your family as well. So just to promote the importance of being continually with a godly man, right? Whenever that opportunity arises, I'll continue on. This is verse 12. It says, whose mind is according to thy mind, and who will sorrow with thee if thou shalt miscarry, right? So, this, it's just an important element of actually, seeking, that proper, that counsel, and being in the presence of a godly man, or, especially amongst brothers, what I'm saying? Because, like I said before, that those kinds of conversations are very, very limited, because most of the time what the kinds of conversations you hear are ultimately the ones that are going to vex you and irritate you, right? And the scriptures talk about, a wise man, he scarcely smiles a little, right? Because their conversations are on a very, very, low vibration, because they're basically speaking about things that are absolutely folly. They're not actually not edifying, right? We think about things that actually promote life, whether it's the kingdom of heaven, righteous rulership, the importance of culture and customs and so on and so forth, the importance of, just basically righteous rulership that's actually exemplified, the importance of, things being in order, whether it's women or the animals and things being taken care of properly. You know what I'm saying? These are the discourse of kings, right? Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Ecclesiasticus, these are the writings of kings, right? These are not low level, people, right? King Solomon wasn't a low level individual, right? So these are the things that, of discourse, right? That actually we're tuned into that discourse, right? Because we're supposed to be a nation of kings and priests, right? But, I kind of wanted to hit, let me get this in Sirach as well before I move on. This is Sirach chapter 8. This is Sirach chapter 8, verse 8. And it says, despise not the discourse of the wise, but acquaint thyself with their proverbs. And it says, for of them, thou shalt learn instruction, and and how to serve great men with ease, right? So that's very important. And it's a good example of that when you read the book of Tobit. Despite the fact that, okay, yes, Tobit was going through his moments of suffering, and he lost his eyesight. There's a chapter in Tobit where you basically get like a glimpse or a snapshot, right, of Tobit basically passing on that godly advice, to his son, right? Passing on those precepts, right? That to give him that understanding of how to actually conduct himself when he gets old, because the scriptures talk about how to train up a child in the way that they should go. And when you look at the behaviors of a lot of our children growing up to be, adults, and you see that they're not trained up in the proper way. They're basically degenerates of a strange vine. They can't conduct themselves. They're very unruly amongst the heathens. They're basically like a reproach. They're basically like a reproach, and they have a very bad what's the word I'm looking for? They have a very bad image. They have a very bad behavior, right? They don't know how to actually conduct themselves with grace, especially in the eyes of the other nations, right? And this is something that Moses outlined in Deuteronomy, that keep therefore and do them, then this is your wisdom and the sight of the other nations, to roughly paraphrase, right? Because the nations are supposed to look at you as basically a wise and understanding people. They're not supposed to look at you as degenerates, but this is the way, this is what Babylon promotes. And our people, they behave like complete degenerates, right? You can see the way in the disgust, that a lot of these other nations have for us as a people, Let me continue on here. This is verse 9. And it says, miss not to the discourse of elders, for they also have learned of their fathers, and of them thou shalt learn understanding, and give answer as need requireth, right? So, it's just the importance of the, having those elders. And that's a very important portion, as I said before, in terms of culture. But, we understand through the curses, there's been a breaking up of families. We would have all this animosity between families, what I'm saying? So, ultimately, understanding and our minds being renewed, we understand that, okay, elders and, bishops and these are the kinds of people that, we were supposed to actually have some, levels of wisdom and understanding and so on and so forth, and then they pass that on to, younger brothers, like myself, right? What I'm saying? those things are very important for children's development, right? Because as a culture, that's strongly been taken away, you know. So I kind of wanted to just hit just a quick story. It's kind of in fragments, but before I just bear with me 1 second. I wanted to read this. This is just to show you the importance of being continually with a godly man, right? This is the book of Second Chronicles, chapter 23. I'll start at verse 9 and I'll read down to 11. I want to jump around. And it says here, then Jehoiada, the priest, gave to the captains of hundreds the spears and the large and small shields which had been King David's, which were in the house of the Most High. And I'm reading in the AMP, in the Amplified. This is verse 10, and he says, and he stationed the people around the king as guards for him, every man with his weapon in his hand, from the right to the left side of the house, and by the altar and by the house. And it says, verse 11, and then they brought out the king's son and put a crown on him and gave him the testimony, a copy of the Mosaic law, so basically the laws of Moses, and made him king. And Jehoiada and his sons anointed him and said, long live the king. So I'm reading this, it's just a short synopsis of what's going on here. So you had one of the descendants, King Ahab's daughter, basically her name was Athaliah, and she had slew a lot of the royal house of Judah, right? So when she learned that her son had passed away, she basically tried to kill off the sons and of Judah. And basically this son that's being anointed here, his name was Joash. So he's really, really young at this present time. But the king, I'm sorry, not the king, the priest here, Jehoiada, was he played a very, very important role of making sure that line, that royal house of Judah, had to be preserved, right? You remember, Yahushua comes from this line, right? So, he was very, very important. Him and his wife, they played a very, very important portion in making sure that this line, this lineage, this bloodline was being preserved here, right? So he stationed, made sure that, the other Levites and the priests made sure that, the house was well protected, because Joash here, his name's not mentioned, his name is mentioned in the next chapter. They had to make sure that this son here, this heir, right, he had to continue to live on and basically become king, so he can actually continue the bloodline, continue the lineage, right? So I want to jump to chapter 24. I kind of just want to hit this in terms of the importance of a godly man, right? In terms of passing on that instruction, onto, the younger a younger seed, a younger Israelite, right? So this is 2 Chronicles 24, verse 1. And I'll read it in the AMP, and it says, and Joash was 7 years old when he became king and reigned for 40 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Zibiah from Beersheba. I'm reading in the AMP. And it says, verse 2, and Joash did what was right in the eyes of the Lord all the days of Jehoiada, the priest, his uncle, right? So the priest here, he was very, like I said before, he was very important in preserving that line, and he was kind of like family in a sense too, because he was married to Jehosheba, which was one of the descendants of Judah as well, right? So she was, the wife, they made sure that, she made sure that son was protected, right? But, during, he made sure, the priest here, Jehoiada, made sure that, he guided him and made sure he preserved him, to making sure that he would be basically the next king, right? So it just really just shows the importance of priests, importance of godly men, within our culture, just to make sure that the younger generation, gets gets that what's that word, that proper godly nutrition, if that makes sense, right? Even though the story, when you read throughout the story, after the priest, passed away, the son of the priest named Zachariah, he got stoned by the son, right? So the king here, Joash, he began to go off, and he got rid of the priest's son, after the priest Jehoiada had passed away, right? So it's a very interesting a story, but the point I really just wanted to hit, he was very strongly influenced, like the title here, it says young Joash influenced by Jehoiada, right? Because the priests were important in teaching the people the importance of what is holy versus what is profane. A good example of that, if you read in Chronicles, I believe it's the 17th chapter, during the reign of Jehoshaphat, one of the righteous kings, you see why the priests were actually important in making sure our people knew the difference between right and wrong, right? So this is basically a good example of somebody, a godly man, who was passing on that information to make sure that that son, that heir of the descendants of Judah had to be preserved, right? So I kind of just wanted to touch on this real quick. The story does turn but it's a very interesting story. But Lord's will, this lesson was just quick and edifying, just to show the importance of godly men, and to basically hear that discourse, so to speak. I know a good example of that is, not to ramble on too much, is well, basically the opposite would be an example, was Rehoboam, because Rehoboam, basically during his rulership, he ignored the counsel. He had the counsel of the godly men, but he ignored it, and he went towards basically he followed the counsel of the young men, right? So it shows you the importance of not just the godly men, their importance, but taking and then who you're taking counsel from as well, right? Because for us younger brothers, sometimes you might think that, okay, this person is within our family, so to speak. Just because they're within your family, it doesn't mean that they're going to give you good counsel, right? And in Sirach, it lists the different examples of the kinds of people not to hearken onto their counsel, right? For example, you're not going to hearken onto counsel from a lazy person, and they're talking about work and stuff like that. If they're lazy, you're not, that's the type of people you're not going to take counsel from, because they're not genuine and they don't actually have a fear of the Lord, right? So anyways, I've rambled on quite a bit, but Lord's will, this lesson was just quick and edifying. Just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashem Shai. Until next time, I say Shalom.